So it's been a really long time since we talked about Nintendo stock, and my earliest viewers probably remember that Nintendo used to be my number one largest stock in my portfolio. It was right up there with AMD and Disney, and back when I started the channel, those used to be like the top three stocks that I would talk about all the time, and everybody would tell me to stop talking about those and talk about other stocks instead. But ever since then, Nintendo performed very well. I made a ton of money on my Nintendo position, and I ended up cashing in a lot of those profits and selling out of the majority of my position, only keeping a small position left over kind of for the long term. But ever since then, we haven't really talked about Nintendo, and lately a lot of you have been asking me to give you an update on Nintendo, which is kind of funny because people used to ask me to stop talking about it. Now people want me to actually give you an update. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about where I think this stock is kind of headed in the medium to long term, how the company is performing, and where I think they're headed in the future, and if I plan on selling the remainder of my position or if I plan to add to that position anytime soon. So I hope you guys enjoy this. Should be a fun video. Let's get started. What's up everyone, my name is Ale. Welcome back to my world of stocks. So as I mentioned, this used to be one of my biggest positions, but I ended up selling a lot of it. So let's go ahead and start by pulling up the stock chart and let's take a look at where I was buying and selling. Okay, so as you can see here, the stock has performed extremely well so far this year, up by close to 40% in 2019 alone, but it's up even more over the past 5 years by close to 200%. But if we zoom out a little to the past decade, we can see that the stock was really struggling a lot before that. And we'll talk about the reasons why in just a second, but for context, I did most of my buying in the $20 range and a little bit below and maybe a little bit above, with most of my selling coming in the $40 range and also a little bit below and a little bit above. But overall, I more than doubled my money on Nintendo, and after doing that, I kind of just wanted to take my profits off the table and cash those in. So I sold about 80% of my position in Nintendo, and I still hold about 20%, a little bit kind of for the long term, because I still see some future potential left for Nintendo. But before we get into the future, let's talk a little bit about the past. Nintendo used to be a high-flying stock back when they released the Nintendo Wii in late 2006, which propelled the stock to over $70 about 1 year later. But unfortunately for Nintendo, we had the global financial crisis and the Great Recession, which brought down the overall markets, with Nintendo included. And to add even more insult to injury, Nintendo launched the Wii U back in 2012, which was supposed to be a generational upgrade from the Nintendo Wii, but because of horrible marketing and such a similar name to the original Wii, nobody really understood what the Wii U was, and they ended up not really purchasing it. They thought it was just kind of a little upgrade to it that you could just kind of add on to the Nintendo Wii, and so nobody really saw the point in buying it. And because of that, Nintendo sales plummeted while the company struggled to push through many years of disappointing performance, as you can see on this chart. Now, something that you will also notice is that the stock started to really rally heavily, especially in 2016 and 2017. And the reason for that was because of the Nintendo Switch console, which is also the reason why I started to buy the stock myself. And that console officially launched in early 2017, and the reason why I was so bullish on that product is because it revolutionized the way that we play video games on home consoles, giving you the option to play on a big screen TV or switch, and I'm doing kind of air quotes here, switch over to portable handheld gaming where you could just kind of pick up the console and go. And I just saw so much promise in that concept that I decided to go all in on the stock, and thankfully it paid off. Up until March of this year, the Nintendo Switch has sold nearly 35 million units in total so far. For context, it has now sold close to 3 times more than the previous home console, which was the Wii U, despite it only being a very short amount of time versus the Wii U launching all the way back in 2012. Now, that still pales in comparison to the original Wii that sold over 100 million units in its total lifespan, but there's still plenty of time for the Switch to bring in even more sales in the future, which we'll talk about in just a second. But taking a look at their sales over the past decade, you can see that they really plummeted very hard for many years before finally returning to growth after the launch of the Nintendo Switch, doing nearly $11 billion in sales last year alone, which, by the way, Nintendo reports their fiscal years ending in March, so that's why their last year shows as 2019, because it's just kind of their fiscal year. In any case, there is a concern going forward, and that happens to be growth. Don't get me wrong, they're expected to continue growing this next year with another 18 million Switch units projected to sell, which would put them well over 50 million in total, but their sales growth is expected to drop from 14% last year to only 4% this year, which is a very big drop off. To be clear though, it is extremely common for Nintendo to dramatically underpromise and overperform whenever they give guidance. I don't know if that's like a Japanese thing, but I just see them do it all the time, where they constantly just kind of give very low guidance and then they usually beat it. So I really do think that they will beat that revenue growth kind of guidance, but it's still a scary thought to see them slow down by such a huge amount, because even if they beat it, you got to figure that it's going to be quite a bit lower. On the bright side, their profits continue to look very strong, with net income growing by almost 40% last year. Again, that growth will probably slow down by a very large amount as we progress through this newest generation cycle, and it still leaves them with a trailing PE ratio of almost 25, which isn't exactly cheap. And that's another thing that I don't really like about Nintendo, is that because it's a foreign stock, it can be very difficult to find analyst coverage or valuation metrics without having to do a lot of the work yourself. For example, Seeking Alpha and Yahoo Finance, they might give you a trailing PE ratio, but they won't give you any kind of future estimates because they just don't have the analysts covering it, so they don't have the estimates themselves. So it just makes it more difficult to predict the future. So you're probably starting to see a trend here where a company like Nintendo, that is such a pure play on video games, is heavily reliant on their generational console sales for their whole kind of business cycle that tends to go up in the beginning and then kind of plateaus and tapers off towards kind of the second half of their cycle. And the reason for that is because their newest generational console will get a lot of hype going. It'll attract new customers. YouTubers will make videos about it, so they kind of get a bunch of free advertising. There's just a lot of hype that ends up driving up sales very high, a lot of sales growth in the kind of first half of the cycle, and then that kind of plateaus and tapers off in the second half of the cycle. And when you're looking at cycles of around 5 years or more, when looking at the Nintendo Switch, that console is already over 2 years old. So it's not exactly surprising to see their sales kind of plateau a little bit in terms of their growth. And that's a scary thought for me, because I'm somebody who is a lot more of a growth investor than a value investor. So I like to see a lot of growth in my stocks. And so you might be asking, well, why are you even still in Nintendo? Well, for starters, I ended up cashing in, a lot of profits. I sold about 80% of my position. So I wouldn't necessarily say that, I'm still kind of in Nintendo. I am definitely in it, but I've sold so much of it that only a small position remains. And the reason for that is because I wanted to take advantage of that kind of first half of the cycle and then limit my position in the second half because of the increased risk. But when looking forward, I do still hold that remaining position for a few different reasons, because there are actually some catalysts for continued growth in the future. And so let's take a look at what those reasons are. I'll give you 3 top reasons why I'm still in this stock. Okay, reason number 1 is the new Nintendo Switch Lite and the rise of mobile gaming. If we go back to that infographic from Nintendo that shows the sales of their consoles, we can see that some of their biggest or best-selling game consoles were actually small portable ones. The Nintendo 3DS sold over 75 million units, the DS sold over 154 million units, the original Game Boy sold almost 120 million units, and the Game Boy Advance sold another 81 million units, while all other home gaming consoles minus the Nintendo Wii really pale in comparison. Well, to combat the slowing growth of their Switch cycle, Nintendo recently announced a new version called the Nintendo Switch Lite that does sell for $100 cheaper at $200 per unit. Granted, this version does take away the best selling point of the Switch, which is to, again, air quotes, be able to switch between portable and home gaming on a TV, as it only allows the user to play in portable handheld mode. But there's no denying that the market for handheld gaming is much bigger than just traditional kind of couch home gaming. In fact, if we take a look at the gaming industry as a whole, we can see that the market is growing by billions of dollars every single year with a double-digit compound annual growth rate, but it's really mobile gaming that makes up the vast majority of that growth at over 26% versus PC at only 3% and console at 2%. And yes, I know technically the Nintendo Switch is still a console, but it's also a handheld console, and even more so with the Switch Lite, it's definitely a handheld console, and that's very similar to mobile gaming. So I think that a lot of the growth can kind of transfer over because it's at a cheaper price point and it'll reach a bigger audience. Not to mention that Nintendo is also making a lot of progress on smartphone gaming as well, as their mobile business saw related income jump by 17% last year, while making up close to a fifth of their total operating profit. Not to mention that they plan to release multiple mobile games a year, with this year alone seeing the release of Dr. Mario World, which was already released, and they also have Mario Kart Tour coming up, which should be released sometime soon. And that brings me to reason number 2, which is that Nintendo continues to see very strong video game sales. This chart here shows the video game sales for the Nintendo Wii U in the red line, and you can see that it was incredibly low heading into the launch of the Switch, which shows up as the green line, and you can see that their video game sales really shot up like a rocket ship. In fact, hardware sales for the Switch were only up about 13%, but software sales increased by almost 87% this past year. That's in large part thanks to Super Smash Bros. Doing over 13 million units and Pokemon Let's Go doing over 10 million units, with all games for the Switch combined selling over 118 million units, and again, that's just for 2019 alone. And they expect the number to get even bigger in 2020 with projections of 125 million units. And I think they can easily hit that when you consider the strong lineup that they have coming up that includes a new remake of Zelda that everyone is really excited about, a new Super Mario Maker 2 that has already released, and it nearly doubled the sales of the first version. I believe that was in the first week. And they also have the first ever true kind of mainline core series Pokemon game ever coming to a home gaming console in Pokemon Sword and Pokemon Shield. And I know that technically we had Pokemon Let's Go last year, but a lot of people don't really consider it the same, and a lot of people have been begging for a true kind of mainline Pokemon game for the TV, so I think that this could be very big for them considering the insane popularity of the franchise. Which happens to bring us to reason number 3, and that is the incredibly strong brands of Nintendo. If we take a look at the highest selling entertainment media franchises of all time, Pokemon comes in at number 1 with around $90 billion estimated, which is even ahead of Star Wars, and then Mario comes in at number 8, with both of them being ahead of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So, and those are some really big franchises, so these are obviously some very lucrative brands. And if we narrow it down to just video games, it's not even close, as both Pokemon and Mario take up the top 2 spots. Not to mention that the newest Pokemon movie was a huge success, grossing almost $420 million worldwide, setting new records for a movie based on a video game, and they also have plans to release a Super Mario Bros. Movie in the next couple of years. And I'll just throw in 2 quick bonus reasons to make things a little more fun and interesting, and that is that Nintendo, the first one is that Nintendo is partnering with Tencent to launch the Nintendo Switch in China, and while we don't have any kind of release date yet because China has some very strict gaming regulations in the country, it is still expected that Nintendo will be granted permission, given that most of their games are very family friendly and they don't really violate a lot of China's policies when it comes to gaming and things like that. So this could be a huge deal for Nintendo because China is practically as big, if not bigger, of a gaming market than the United States, and their population is the highest in the world. So it's a huge market. And the other bonus reason is that their new Nintendo Switch online subscription service already has about 10 million subscribers in the first year alone, and that can be a great source of recurring revenue in the future. Granted, the service has been heavily criticized for being bare bone. I'm a huge critic of it myself because it doesn't have a lot of the old games from previous consoles. It only has the original Nintendo, which is something that I couldn't care less about. But I wouldn't be surprised if Nintendo does decide to throw in older games from other consoles like the Nintendo 64, the Super Nintendo, things like that in the future, especially during their 1-year anniversary in this coming September, to kind of convince gamers who are having their 1-year subscriptions expiring, maybe it'll convince them to resubscribe for an additional year. That could be a great move. In any case, when it comes to Nintendo, there's obviously a lot of pros and cons, and the stock is just kind of all over the place, which is one of the reasons why, again, I sold out so much of my position and limited my exposure to kind of limit my risk, because I just feel they're kind of all over the place. When you look at the Nintendo Switch, I think there's definitely still some catalysts that could drive up sales even further, even in the kind of later stages of the cycle, because you have the Nintendo Switch Lite, which caters to an enormous market. And then there are also rumors of a Nintendo Switch Pro, which could beef up the specs, basically make it a more powerful console, which is something that I think they really need to do, because you already have the PlayStation and the Xbox releasing new generational consoles next year, and they're going to be like light years ahead of the Nintendo Switch in terms of performance. So at this point, the Nintendo Switch has to upgrade their specs, because if you want to attract third-party developers, if you want to have all the video games that go to the Xbox and the PlayStation, and you want to have a lot of those games come to the Nintendo Switch, you got to have a more powerful console that can actually run those. And that's another concern I have for the Nintendo Switch, because if Nintendo becomes complacent here and they don't upgrade the console and don't make it more powerful, and you're going to continue to see this problem of not having a lot of third-party support, and I think that's ultimately going to limit your target audience, like how much of an audience you can actually target. So that needs to happen as well. So I remain invested in Nintendo because I want to see how the Nintendo Switch Lite does, which is a huge market. I want to see if they upgrade to a Nintendo Switch Pro, which I think that 1-2 punch could target an enormous audience. And I also want to see if they add some value to the Nintendo Switch Online subscription service, if they bring back their old backlog catalog of games from previous generational consoles and make that available to the Nintendo Switch for a monthly fee, kind of like a Netflix type of service, then that makes it a huge value, and I could see those subscription numbers just kind of going through the roof. And then I also want to see how the Pokemon games perform this year in terms of sales, because I think that's really the next kind of mainline core series of Pokemon games that a lot of their fan base has been begging for, to allow them to play them on a big screen TV. And this is kind of the first time we'll ever have that. I know we technically did kind of have that with the Pokemon Let's Go series, but it's a different type of series. This one I think is what all the Nintendo gamers and Pokemon fans really wanted. So I think the Pokemon sales will be also through the roof. So I want to see those things happen, and that's why I remain in the stock with a reduced, very small position, just to kind of see what happens in the coming years. But also just kind of keep in mind the PlayStation 4 sold a huge amount of consoles, maybe like over 100 million. The Wii definitely sold over 100 million. So the Switch at only 35 million is still only a fraction of that. So I think there is definitely still some room to keep growing, especially with the Lite and if they release a Pro. Not to mention the other markets that they can still tap into, like China that we talked about earlier. But anyway, we'll have to just see what happens. This is definitely a very interesting stock to watch. I don't know that anybody who's not invested in Nintendo should be jumping in at this point, especially if you're not familiar with the company. But if you're very familiar with Nintendo and you like what they do, I think there are definitely some reasons to stay positive, even with the stock kind of running up this high already and heading kind of this late into the Nintendo Switch kind of life cycle. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure you hit the like button. Really means a lot to me. Subscribe if you haven't already. Leave your thoughts and comments down below. I'd love to read them, especially if you're a gamer. I want to hear everyone's perspective, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.